Before we begin, if you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, leave a comment with what time it is, okay, and where in the world you're resting. Okay. It helps others find this space to die. And if these forgotten stories matter to you, consider subscribing, not just to this channel, but to the quiet act of remembering. Asterisk, there was a room in Montgomery, Alabama that never let in much light. The shutters stayed closed most days. The walls kept quiet. And yet, behind those quiet walls, loud truth echoed, one that still makes its way into history books, whispered in footnotes, or buried behind the gleam of a surgical instrument. Dr. J. Marion Sims, once called the father of modern gynecology, had made his way from Lancaster County, South Carolina, into the corridors of medical glory. But the beginning of that journey didn't start with textbooks. It started with pain. The pain of women whose names the textbooks nearly erased. The pain of women who were enslaved, who could not say no, who were never asked to. The story begins in the late 1840s, at a time when science was desperate to solve one particular problem: vesico-vaginal fistulas. These are holes that form between the bladder and the vaginal wall, often the result of prolonged or obstructed labor. Women who suffered from it would leak urine constantly, unable to control it. They were ostracized, humiliated, and often left to die socially, if not physically. Dr. Sims wanted to fix it. But to fix it, he believed he had to experiment. And to experiment, he believed he needed subjects. Not volunteers, subjects. He acquired them through the system that made them invisible and disposable. These were enslaved black women whose legal status meant their bodies could be borrowed, altered, tacted, all without the word consent ever entering the conversation. In Sims's own notes, he names 3 women: Annika, Betsy, and Lucy. But historians suspect there were more, many more, who never even got the dignity of record. Annika was perhaps the most mentioned. She was 17 years old when she arrived, barely older than a child. She had just survived a brutal labor that lasted over 3 days. Her child did not survive. Her body was torn. She was in unimaginable pain. She needed healing. Instead, she was studied. The procedures began. Dr. Sims did not believe in anesthesia, not for these women. Ether was available and used in some medical circles by the mid-1840s. But Sims insisted black women did not feel pain in the same way white women did. This belief, a racist myth cloaked in pseudoscience, gave him moral permission to operate while the women were fully conscious. The procedures were excruciating. Surgical instruments were primitive. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Sims often worked with the help of other enslaved people, men he trained to assist in the surgeries. Annika, for example, underwent at least 30 separate surgeries, about 30 each time. Her body was opened, examined, sewn, and left to heal, or fail to heal, each time. She returned to the room, and yet, perhaps most quietly remarkable of all, she survived. The surgeries were not done in hospitals. They were done in his backyard, a makeshift clinic. No clean linens, no nurses. The women often lay on hands and knees, bound, held down by force. Pain was not just tolerated, it was studied. What does it mean to be called a pioneer when the road you paved was carved from someone else's skin? Dr. Sims eventually did succeed in his quest to repair the fistula. And when he presented his findings to the American medical community, it was hailed as a triumph. His techniques formed the basis of modern pelvic surgery. Statues were raised. Schools bore his name, the names of the women. Only in the margins, only when remembered by those who knew to look. Even Sims's medical writings reveal a disturbing disconnection. He speaks of the subject more than the woman. He wrote about their suffering clinically, noting pain levels only when it mattered for surgical outcome, not for empathy. His notes often omitted their emotional responses, Perhaps because they didn't matter to him, or perhaps because they mattered too much to admit. In one of his most cited journals, he praised the courage of Lucy, one of the women who nearly died from blood poisoning during an early surgery. He admired her endurance, but not her humanity. Some medical scholars argue that the science of the time lacked proper frameworks for informed consent. Others argue that Sims simply reflected the values of his era, that enslaved people were property and their use in experiments was considered normal in the South. But these arguments avoid a deeper question, one that still lingers in today's hospitals and medical schools. Why did no one ask them? Why did no one believe they could say no? The room in Montgomery wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a classroom. It wasn't a place of healing. It was a place where science grew roots in soil drenched with silence and blood. And the surgeries never really ended, because their consequences echo forward into modern medicine. Keen to the trust between black women and their doctors. Keen still dismissed. The symptoms still minimized. Anarcha's story didn't end on the table. But what was her life like after the surgeries? Did she ever get to choose again? Did she ever stop being someone's subject? Or did the world move on before she ever got to speak? Anarcha walked again. That alone would have been seen as proof of progress in the eyes of the man who cut her open so many times. Her clothes were no longer soaked, her body no longer leaking. But healing is not always visible to the eye, and it is almost never measured solely by the absence of one symptom. After the final surgery, Anarcha was sent back to the plantation from which she had come. The same fields, the same shack, the same expectations of labor. Her name did not change. Her status did not change. There were no accolades, no moment of pause to acknowledge what she had endured, what she had given unwillingly to science. The silence was total. No records exist of her later life. No diary, no letter. No grave with her name on it that we can find in Sims's notes. She disappears, and yet the world around her did not stop moving. Sims had taken his success to New York City, where he opened the first hospital for women in 1855. It was a prestigious institution, and it was white. His patients were affluent. His methods, perfected on the backs of the women in Montgomery, were now applied in cleaner rooms, on cushioned tables. With anesthesia finally in use, the very idea of gynecology as a specialty had been solidified, and Sims was at the center of it. He was appointed president of the American Medical Association. He served as the president of the American Gynecological Society. He traveled to Europe, where Queen Victoria reportedly consulted him. His name became synonymous with surgical innovation. But Anarcha, Betsy, Kay, Lucy, and the others, whose names we don't have, had built that platform with their bodies, somewhere in some southern field. Kay and Arca may have been hoeing rows again, now older, now carrying the scars. Not just surgical ones, but deeper ones. The kind that form when no one ever asked if you were in pain. The kind that last when pain is turned into paper and printed in journals as progress today. Many women in the United States, particularly black women, still face systemic barriers to adequate medical care. Studies have shown that black patients are less likely to be prescribed pain medication than white patients for the same conditions. In labor and delivery rooms, black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from childbirth complications than white women. The gap widens with poverty, but does not disappear with wealth. Even tennis star Serena Williams, one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, had to insist that doctors take her postpartum symptoms seriously. She was right. She had a pulmonary embolism. The roots of that disbelief can be traced back through decades of racial bias in medicine, and those roots trace back, unmistakably, to Sims's practice and the mythology that surrounded him. The mythology lasted far longer than it should have. For more than a century, Sims was praised in textbooks and celebrated in medical education. The statue of Sims that stood in Central Park, bronze and towering, coat buttoned, gaze lifted toward the sky, was placed there in 1894. He held a surgical instrument in one hand, but he held nothing that belonged to the women. In fact, it took until 2018 for that statue to come down. The city of New York finally removed it after years of protests from medical ethicists, historians, and descendants of enslaved communities. And even in its removal, the decision was controversial. Some argued it was erasing history, but others argued it was finally telling it honestly, without the silence. What would have happened if Sims had acknowledged their pain? What would modern medicine look like if their names had appeared beside his in every lecture? Historians have long debated whether Sims was a product of his time or a particularly cruel example of it, but the debate often misses the women, centers him, his motives, his beliefs. He forgets to ask what Anarcha believed, or Lucy, or Betsy. He forgets that they may have dreamed of lives beyond the operating table, that they may have wished to be something other than a body to be studied, that they, too, had knowledge. Maybe Lucy had been a midwife. Maybe Betsy had delivered children in the fields long before Sims ever used forceps. Maybe Anarcha's mother taught her about healing herbs. That knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved women was often dismissed, even as it was borrowed by white doctors who then claimed it as science. Sims himself admitted, in letters rarely quoted, that these women showed remarkable calm during procedures. But perhaps that was not calm at all. Perhaps it was resignation. Or perhaps it was resistance in its quietest form, enduring, something with eyes open, refusing to give the reaction he might have expected. Did they speak to one another at night, between surgeries? Did they comfort each other in whispers, out of Sims's hearing? Did they plot escape, not from the clinic, but from the future he was building without them? Their stories were never recorded, but their bodies remembered. Modern medicine now demands consent forms, ethics boards, and pain management. But those things were not born out of thin air. They were born from centuries of failure, from the moments in history when human dignity was optional. What would it look like to go back, not to revise history, but to include it? What if every medical student today had to memorize Anarcha's name just as they memorized Sims's? What if every surgical technique came with a footnote, not just of invention, but of the cost? Asterisk. If you walk through Montgomery, Alabama today, there are no signs pointing you to the backyard where Dr. J. Marion Sims performed his experiments. There is no brass plaque honoring Anarcha, no stone engraved with Betsy's voice, no quiet garden where Lucy is remembered. You can pass through those streets and never know what happened there, but the absence has weight. History often leaves its deepest marks in silence, the kind of silence that hangs not because no one cared, but because those who did were never asked, never allowed to write, never allowed to speak in the spaces where records were kept. That silence surrounds Anarcha. She was only 17 when her body was opened again and again in the name of progress. We know this number from the ledgers of men who did not consider her human enough to ask permission. And after the experiment, when Sims left Montgomery, she was left behind, in body and in record. Nothing more is known of her life. No death date. No mention in letters. She disappears from history as so many enslaved women did, not by accident, but by design. Her erasure was part of the system that used her, but erasure is not the same as forgetting. In recent years, there has been a quiet effort to recenter Anarcha and the others in the history they helped shape. Scholars, writers, and descendants have begun calling them not subjects, but co-founders of modern gynecology, though no institution has yet made that title official. Their names are spoken in small community gatherings, medical ethics panels, and, more recently, protests for reproductive justice. In 2017, a statue was unveiled, not to Sims, but to Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, sculpted by artist Michelle Browder. The monument is called the Mothers of Gynecology, and it stands not in marble perfection, but in recycled metal mirrors, hospital tools, discarded wires, fragments of modern life, reconstructed to honor what was never whole. Each figure in the sculpture is tall, defiant, regal. Each face is deliberate, formed from materials donated by Black women around the country. Jewelry, keys, metal heirlooms. The things women carried. The things they kept. The statue does not ask for forgiveness. It asks for remembrance. And that is where we are left, remembering women who were never allowed to forget. Their pain was not theoretical. It was not distant. It was lived, breathed, survived. And survival is rarely clean. Anarcha's survival was not a triumph. It was a shadow, the kind that walks alongside progress but never gets to where it's crowned. We live in a world built on contradictions. Medicine saves lives, but it has also taken liberties with lives it deemed lesser. Scientific breakthroughs have come at human cost, sometimes unspoken, sometimes denied. The legacy of Sims is not just a man with a scalpel. It is the story of what happens when a society decides who gets pain relief, okay, and who does not. And yet, amid that shadow, there is something else, a flicker of resistance, an undercurrent of power. Because even without their own words, Anarcha and the others continue to teach. They force questions. They demand discomfort, okay? And in doing so, they shape the conversation, not just about what medicine is, but what it should never be again. Anarcha may have never stood in a classroom, but her body was turned into one, and we, quietly, finally, are starting to listen. Somewhere, perhaps, she is buried beneath Alabama soil. Perhaps there is no grave marker. Perhaps her name is misspelled in the record book, or not listed at all. But above that soil, now, stands a monument that calls her by name, her real name, and that is a start. Just a start. But sometimes, in history, a start is all we're allowed. Asterisk, long before she was cut open, long before she was the girl on the table, Anarcha was a daughter, possibly a sister, likely a field worker, almost certainly a name whispered quietly in the hush of Alabama dawns, a name that would later be remembered, not for who she was, but for what was done to her. She was born into slavery around 1828 or 1829. No exact date, of course. Black children born into bondage were rarely given birth certificates. They were listed in ledgers, the same way livestock were recorded by number, by estimated age, sometimes by weight. Her birth was not an event celebrated, but an economic notation. She was property, okay? And property did not require birthdays. The plantation where she lived has never been definitively identified. Some historians suggest it was near Montgomery, Alabama, a region thick with cotton fields, and even thicker with the cruel systems required to sustain them, whether it was a small holding or a vast estate. Anarcha's days would have been predictable in their labor and punishing in their repetition, wake before the sun, hoe in the dirt, tend to the cotton, take the orders, avoid the overseer's gaze, obey the rhythms of a life where choice did not exist. It is easy to look back at those days and reduce them to generalized suffering, to imagine slavery only as whips and chains, fields and cabins. For Anarcha, suffering was likely more quiet. Her pain was lived in the joints, the skin, the stomach. Hunger gnawed constantly. Cold crept through the floorboards. In winter, there were moments of laughter, too, probably. Children find joy wherever they can, and Anarcha might have giggled while grinding corn or teased a friend in whispered Southern Creole behind a white family's back. But even laughter wasn't hers to keep enslaved. Children were often separated from their mothers young, sold, moved, loaned out, may have been raised by someone who wasn't her birth mother. Or perhaps she clung tightly to her mother until she was old enough to be sent elsewhere. Some girls were rented to other plantations, their labor bartered as easily as a sack of rice. By the time she was in her teens, her body had already been marked, not just by sun and toil, but by expectation. Black girls were pushed into womanhood early. Menstruation was often followed by sexual vulnerability. There was no protection from white men's attention or from the casual violence of enslavers who saw reproduction as profit. Young girls were frequently paired with older men to breed, whether by force or structure. Motherhood came early. Anarcha's pregnancy was likely her first. She would have been around 17, still a child in her bones. But a woman in the economy of the plantation. What is known is that her labor lasted more than 3 days. Imagine that. 3 days of pain, no breaks, no doctor, no comfort. In the world of slavery, complications during childbirth were common and deadly. Malnutrition, overwork, and a lack of medical access made labor incredibly risky. And when it went wrong, as it did for Anarcha, it went very wrong. The child died, and Anarcha was left with more than grief. She was left with a fistula. This condition, rarely spoken of now, but feared then, created a tear between her vaginal canal and her bladder. Urine leaked constantly. Smell was unbearable. Her clothing stayed wet. The shame, engineered by the same society that ignored her humanity, became a second injury in many plantations. Women like Anarcha were shunned, treated as unclean, sometimes even isolated from others. But for Dr. J. Marion Sims, who had recently moved to Montgomery, this condition was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. He was a physician, restless and ambitious. He had failed in his early career attempts. His treatments for childhood illness and general malaise weren't working. He needed something new, something bigger, a problem that white medicine had yet to solve. And when a white plantation owner brought Anarcha to him, this was not brought as a patient. She was presented as a case, a specimen, a body that might make his name. Sims had never performed gynecological surgery. In fact, he found the idea unpleasant. But here was a chance to experiment with no legal risk, no social pushback, and no need for consent. Anarcha was moved to Sims's property. Along with her came Betsy and Lucy, other women with similar conditions. Whether they were friends before or became so during the long nights after surgery, we do not know. But they were all enslaved, all young, all broken in body, but still breathing, and in Sims's hands. They would become something else. They would become the foundation of a new medical field. But before the surgeries, before the cold tools and calloused hands, there was Anarcha's life. The one she never got to return to. The one where she might have been a mother, or a healer, or simply a woman with her own mornings and her own name. What did she dream of before the blade? Did she ever get a day when no one ordered her to move, or bleed, or obey? What did her voice sound like when she spoke for herself? We'll never know. History didn't listen. Inside the journals of Dr. J. Marion Sims, Anarcha's name is written sparsely and always clinically. He mentions her condition, her body, her reactions to surgery, but he never once records her voice. Not a word of what she may have said. Not a note about how she looked at him. Not even a guess as to how she felt. And so we are left, once again, reading between the lines, not to find facts, but to restore a person. After the plantation owner brought her to Sims, Anarcha was placed under his full control. She was no longer just enslaved. She was now a patient in the loosest sense of the word, a subject in a long, uncontrolled experiment. Sims referred to it as a surgical hospital, but it was his backyard. A small room, a wooden table, no antiseptics, no formal training in the procedures he was about to invent, and no pain relief he did not believe. Black women needed it. Ether had just begun to circulate in American medicine as an anesthetic, an innovation that could have transformed the lives of patients in pain. But Sims argued publicly and repeatedly that black women didn't require it. He believed their nervous systems were less sensitive, that their tolerance for pain was higher, a belief that was not only wrong, but deadly. And it wasn't his alone. It was part of a broader, racist pseudoscience that was used to justify everything, from beatings to unpaid labor to medical experimentation. So Annika, like Lucy and Betsy, was operated on without anesthesia. No numbing, no sedation, nothing to soften the edge of the blade. It is recorded that she endured more than 30 surgeries, each one experimental. Each one guided by Sims's growing ambition to solve the condition of vesicovaginal fistula. But between those procedures, Annika was still a living, breathing young woman. She had to eat, sleep, use the bathroom, heal, or try to. Enslaved men were trained by Sims to assist with the surgeries. They too were forced into roles they never asked for, becoming nurses, attendants, and surgical aides without choice, pay, or training. In a twisted way, Sims had created the first version of a gynecological clinic built entirely on the backs of the enslaved. We don't know what Annika thought of these men. Perhaps she was grateful for their presence. Perhaps she resented the way they had to hold her down. Perhaps they whispered to her in the moments before surgery began, soft words to ease the panic. Perhaps she said nothing at all. After each surgery, she would have been left in bed, her body stitched crudely, her muscles torn. Fistula repair was not simple. The tools were rudimentary: needles, thread, a speculum of Sims's own invention. His earliest models were fashioned from spoons. Yes, spoons. And with those spoons, he looked inside her and called it science. The infection risk was enormous: blood poisoning, sepsis. The odds of recovery were slim, especially without antiseptics. And yet, she lived. The reason, perhaps, was not Sims's genius, God's strength. It is one thing to survive a medical procedure. It is another thing to survive it when the person operating on you does not believe your pain matters, does not see you as fully human, does not ask how you feel. And it is yet another thing to survive it again and again and again. In his writings, Sims would sometimes praise Anarcha's courage. But courage implies choice. It implies awareness and consent. What he called courage may have been survival, it may have been shock, it may have been resignation, or something stronger still, resistance in the form of endurance. Black women in slavery learned early that survival was its own rebellion. To keep breathing, to keep remembering who they were, to protect even the smallest fragment of identity, even as the world insisted they had none. Anarcha may have clung to something, a song, a phrase her mother used to say, the memory of a sibling. We don't know what she held in her heart during those long, painful nights, but we know she held something because she stayed alive. Sims's journals would later become celebrated among gynecological circles. They were reprinted, referenced, taught, but never challenged. Not seriously. Not for over a century. It was not until black scholars began revisiting these records in the mid to late 20th century that the ethical violations became part of the conversation. And even then, many historians defended Sims. They said he was a man of his time, that his patients would have died without intervention, that they may have even consented, as though the very concept of consent could exist. In a system where a person was owned, consent requires freedom. Anarcha had none. And yet, what if she had been asked? What if someone had knelt beside her bed, touched her hand gently, and said, "Do you want this?" What if she had been told there were risks? What if she had been offered pain relief? What if her voice had been taken seriously, not just as data, but as something sacred? Would she have said yes? Or would she have chosen to heal in the dark, in silence, far from the gaze of science? We'll never know, because Sims never asked. In history, for too long, never cared. Anarcha was no longer in the journals. She was no longer spoken of in lectures. After Dr. J. Marion Sims moved to New York and began treating white women with refined tools and anesthesia, Anarcha's name faded from his writings. Her body had been used. Her wound had served its purpose. And so, as was common in the logic of that world, she vanished from the page. But she did not vanish from the earth. She returned to her plantation. Or perhaps she was sold to another. There are no records, only guesses built from patterns. But wherever she went, she carried 30 surgeries inside her. She carried pain, scar tissue, possibly a partial recovery. It's not even clear if Sims's final operation on her had been fully successful. What is clear is that she survived. But surviving is not the same as living. Imagine now the days that followed. The eyes of other enslaved people watching her limp, cued the hushed questions. What did he do to you? Spoken in corners when the overseer wasn't looking. The stink of urine may have faded. The infection may have retreated, but a new kind of injury had replaced it. A spiritual wound, a wound not bound to organs or muscle, but to identity. Anarcha may have once believed she was something before the experiment. A mother, a sister, a girl who belonged to no one but herself, even if the law said otherwise. But after being dissected, without her consent, after being referred to in documents as a subject, a case, a body, what could she call herself now? There are no answers. It's just a shadow. And yet, shadows can teach us more than light. In the decades that followed, Anarcha's name was barely mentioned in textbooks. Her memory was preserved, not by historians, but by fragments, oral traditions, speculative essays, advocacy work by Black scholars and medical students who dug through archives, looking not for the man who was praised, but for the women who were used. Her name began to re-emerge in the late 20th century as part of a broader movement to uncover the unethical foundations of American medicine. Alongside stories like those of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and forced sterilizations in Puerto Rico and California, Anarcha became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of truth withheld. She was no longer just a girl on the table. She was the evidence that medicine had always been political, always been racial, always required someone's body to be made vulnerable so someone else could rise. And through her story, a reckoning began in medical schools across the United States. Today, her name is taught, not always formally, but in quiet corners of student-led ethics discussions, in footnotes of syllabi revised by professors who've chosen to include the uncomfortable truths. Sometimes, a student will write her name in the margin of their notes during gynecology lectures. Sometimes, they speak of her when discussing patient consent. Sometimes, they whisper her name during case studies, as if calling her back from the silence in 2021. The monument to the mothers of gynecology was completed in Montgomery, Alabama. Sculptor Michelle Browder created it not to erase Sims, but to reframe the legacy. Each figure stands over 9 feet tall. They wear expressions of pain, resilience, and dignity. Their bodies are shaped from discarded surgical tools, rusted metal, and bits of mirror fragments that reflect not just light, truth. Visitors stand before them and see themselves, especially Black women, especially those who have been disbelieved, in exam rooms, dismissed in emergency rooms, or ignored during labor, because Anarcha's story is not finished. It repeats, it shifts, it lives in the data that shows Black women's pain is still treated less seriously. It breathes in the stories of women who go into surgery not knowing all their options. It lingers in the gap between who is studied and who gets to do the studying. But something is changing. Today, Black women are becoming doctors, midwives, and medical ethicists. They carry Anarcha's story not as a scar, but as a badge. Not because her suffering was noble, but because it should never have happened. And by naming her again and again, they are doing what history refused to do. They are giving her back her voice, asterisk, her presence, her name, a name she never got back in life, but one that now stands in bronze, in books, in whispered lectures, in public forums. A name that is no longer a footnote. A-N-R-C-H-A. Not a subject, not a case, not a surgical outcome. A girl, then a woman, then a question. What would her life have been? Someone had just asked. In the heart of New Orleans, where the air hangs thick and slow, and even the wind seems tired from history, there once stood a hospital that welcomed every kind of body except the kind that could say no. Touro Infirmary, founded in 1852, named after a wealthy Jewish philanthropist named Judah Touro. He quickly became one of the most well-funded medical institutions in the American South. Its brick walls were clean, its corridors orderly, white. Patients walked in through the main doors, but behind the building, behind the kitchen and stables, was another entrance, one for the black, the poor, the enslaved, the forgotten. They didn't walk in so much as they were brought, dragged, delivered, sometimes after injury, sometimes illness, but often with no ailment at all, only a function to serve in the decades before and after the Civil War. Touro became known not just for its charity or its surgical outcomes, but for something less advertised, something not spoken about at dinner tables or in donor reports. It became a quiet hub for medical education, and medical education, at that time, required bodies, specifically black ones. Consent was not part of the process. There were no forms, no signatures, no explanations. Black patients who entered the infirmary, whether enslaved, newly emancipated, or simply poor, were often treated by students, not doctors. They were examined, measured, cut open. Sometimes they were used for practice, sometimes for demonstration, sometimes for nothing more than observation. How does the black body respond to this? How long until it breaks? If they died, their bodies were kept, not always returned, sometimes buried without a name, sometimes not buried at all, simply preserved for further use. The practice wasn't unique to Touro. It happened in cities all over the country. Something about the quiet professionalism of Touro made it more dangerous, 'cause it looked like progress. The walls were whitewashed. The doctors wore pressed coats. The lecture halls were bright and modern, but the system was rotten beneath. During the Reconstruction era, newly freed black men and women began to seek medical care in earnest. Hospitals like Touro were among the few available, and they came at a cost, a hidden cost. There were reports, even as early as the 1870s, of black patients being admitted for minor issues and subjected to surgeries they had never agreed to. Uterine removal, bladder interventions, in some cases, amputations, medical. Journals would sometimes praise these procedures, citing improved outcomes or novel approaches, but they did not publish the names of the women involved, because those women were not considered sources of knowledge. They were vessels for it, and at the center of this quiet cruelty was the idea that knowledge mattered more than autonomy, that the body of a poor black woman could be used to educate the next generation of white physicians, and that this was a public good. In Touro's medical amphitheater, students sat in semicircles, coats crisp, notebooks open. Below them, on a low table, was the subject, the patient, or the corpse, sometimes awake, sometimes sedated, sometimes already gone. Their names were not announced. Their stories were not shared. Their silence was assumed to be consent. Imagine lying there, half-conscious, pain blooming through your spine, surrounded by young men scribbling notes and staring without shame. Imagine not knowing what was being done to you, Not knowing if the thing being cut was the thing that could be fixed. Not knowing if you would leave the room alive. Many didn't. The story of Turo is not one of monsters in white coats. It is one of ordinary people, trained to look away, of students taught that knowledge came first, and that the lives of the voiceless were a reasonable price, of a system where education and exploitation lived side by side in the same clean hallway. Even decades after the end of slavery, Turo continued to admit black patients to segregated wings and continued to use their bodies disproportionately for instruction. Some medical students would later recall learning on the poor, a phrase so normalized it passed without guilt, and yet behind each lesson was a body, behind each demonstration a life. What did she feel when they lifted the sheet? Atia. No, this was not a treatment, but a performance. Did she want to scream, or had she already stopped trying? Asterisk in the decades following the Civil War. As the South tried to rebuild itself and redefine what it meant to be civilized, the medical community in New Orleans pressed forward. Surgical textbooks, scientific societies, hospital expansions. Turo Infirmary kept growing, its reputation polished by philanthropic donations and glowing reviews in Southern newspapers. But inside its operating rooms, the truth was still sharp and cold. There, beneath bright oil lamps and the smell of alcohol and blood, black patients continued to arrive on tables they did not walk toward willingly. Sometimes they were unconscious. Other times they were fully aware, but with no voice, no advocate, no legal right to stop what was about to happen. Consent, at that time, was not a legal standard. It was a courtesy extended only to the white, the wealthy, or the well-connected. For the black poor, especially women, consent was assumed unnecessary. It was replaced with institutional permission. If a woman was brought in by a workhouse or by a city physician, she could be declared fair use for clinical training. These women were not statistics. They had names, though rarely recorded. They had stories, though rarely preserved. One woman, admitted in 1887 for abdominal pain, was operated on twice in 1 week. Her uterus was removed without her knowledge. The attending notes described the surgery as educationally valuable. She died 3 days later. Her name was not included in the case report. Instead, the report praised the clarity of the demonstration. Medical students remembered these lessons not as horrors, but as milestones. The first time I saw a real uterus, wrote one young physician in a private letter, was in the Turo basement. The woman was awake. I remember that. And the letter moves on to dinner plans, to lectures, to rain, because the moment wasn't considered extraordinary. It was ordinary, routine, expected. There were 2 hospitals in New Orleans at the time that served black communities, Charity Hospital and Turo. Charity had a long-standing reputation for overcrowding and underfunding. Turo was viewed as cleaner, more respectable. But within both, black patients were often placed in the role of material to be studied, not served. At Turo, the line between patient and subject was thinner than a surgical suture. One young woman, believed to be around 16, was admitted with a high fever and stomach swelling. A professor invited students to observe her examination. Without any warning, he inserted a metal instrument, a uterine sound, to determine the state of her internal organs. She cried out in pain. The students laughed nervously. The professor did not stop. He later wrote about the procedure in the Southern Medical Review, citing the opportunity as rare and instructive. He did not mention the girl's reaction. There were others. A woman brought in with a minor ankle injury, awoke to find a pelvic examination had been performed. A girl with migraines given spinal taps without anesthesia. Women with no reproductive complaints at all given vaginal exams by students, practicing technique, always in the name of science, always without their consent. Some were even exhumed. Throughout the late 1800s, black graveyards in New Orleans were often unguarded, poorly recorded. Medical schools in the city, desperate for cadavers, sometimes obtained bodies illegally or through quiet agreements with city officials who would look the other way. Truro was not the only hospital implicated in this practice, but its proximity to multiple burial sites and its growing medical program made it a likely participant. Bodies were labeled Negro, female, unknown, then dissected, then discarded. The names, if ever known, were stripped away. Even the bones were sometimes saved for study, for display. Some are still in medical archives today, their origins untraceable. And so, the hospital became something else, not just a place of treatment, but a factory of forgetting. Even the nurses, many of whom were white immigrant women, were complicit or too afraid to speak. Some may have whispered apologies. Some may have hardened themselves to the routine, but the structure was clear. Black bodies were not guests. They were tools. And yet, through all of this, life continued outside those walls. The women returned to their neighborhoods, if they survived, changed, marked. Some could no longer bear children. Some bled for months. Some simply never came home. And in those neighborhoods, stories were told. They spread slowly, by word of mouth. Don't go to Truro. One mother would say, they'll take something you can't get back. Some families began avoiding hospitals altogether. They relied on midwives, on root healers, on prayer, because they feared the white coat, the clipboard, the friendly voice that asked no real questions. But the fear came at a cost, too. Avoiding medical care meant more black women died at home. More illnesses went untreated. Still, the system blamed them for their distrust, never acknowledging how it was earned. All the while, medical journals published new discoveries, new instruments, new procedures, built quietly on a foundation of stolen decisions. And somewhere, beneath it all, the tables remained cleaned, set again, ready for the next lesson. Asterisk. By the turn of the 20th century, Truro Infirmary had become a pillar of respectability in New Orleans. It boasted advanced equipment, published surgical outcomes in prominent journals, and served as a training ground for generations of physicians. Alumni went on to practice across the American South, many carrying with them techniques first honed on the bodies of women who could not say no. But what the hospital left behind wasn't just improved medical technique. It left behind a trail of missing names. No plaque at Truro tells this story. No hallway honors the hundreds of anonymous patients who endured pain for someone else's education. The official histories, written to mark centennials, renovations, or fundraising milestones, tell of charity, innovation, progress. They rarely mention the price. The students who trained at Truro became doctors. The women who lay on its tables became invisible. And yet, that invisibility had weight. It shaped everything. Medical ethics, as a formal discipline, didn't truly emerge until the mid-20th century. But long before the word ethics was taught in classrooms, women like those treated at Truro were asking their own questions, even if no one heard them. Why am I being touched this way? Why is no one speaking to me? Why am I in more pain now than when I arrived? Their stories, when they survived to tell them, became part of the oral tradition in black communities. Not always with names, not always with details, but always with warning. Hospitals ain't safe for us, some would say. Don't let them do what they did to my cousin. And slowly, those warnings evolved into wisdom. Quiet defiance. Black women across the South created networks of care beyond the white medical system. They formed mutual aid groups. They relied on granny midwives, elderly women, trained not in textbooks, but in generations of lived experience. These midwives delivered babies, treated infections, performed minor surgeries, all with more consent, more dignity, and more understanding than most hospitals would offer for decades. In fact, many of those midwives had once been patients themselves. Some had been experimented on. Some had seen friends die on the table. And in choosing not to replicate that violence, they became healers. This was resistance. Not the loud kind, not the kind honored in statues, but the slow kind, the enduring kind. The kind born in rooms where no one was listening. Truro Infirmary continued to grow. In the 1950s, it opened new wings. In the 1960s, it began to integrate, slowly, and not always willingly. By the 1980s, it had a modern maternity ward, pediatric units, surgical theaters with state-of-the-art equipment. But even then, echoes remained. Black women continued to report being treated differently, rushed through appointments, dismissed, touched without explanation. The ghost of those silent tables was never exorcised. Today, Truro still exists. It is a modern medical center, part of a larger healthcare network. It saves lives. It helps families. It does good work. And yet, part of its foundation remains unspoken. There is no public record of apology. There's no archive of the names that were taken. No formal reckoning with the ways the hospital once used human beings as scaffolding for science. But the stories haven't disappeared. They live in the gaps. In the histories rewritten by patients, the notes of black scholars who pieced together records from basements and burial logs. In the art of descendants who sculpt not just to honor the past, but to confront it. One such artist descended from a Truro patient, built an exhibit called Anatomy of Absence. In it, hospital gowns are embroidered with the names of women, never recorded. Each gown hangs from a wire, floating a body that was used, a body never claimed. Beneath them, empty case files, open books with blank pages, a reminder of how easily pain becomes paperwork and how easily paperwork becomes progress. But real progress, the kind that heals, begins only when silence ends. So we remember them. Asterisk, it began with a contradiction. A nation that saw itself as civilized in an economy that relied on bondage. In the antebellum South, this contradiction was never hidden. It was carved into wood, etched into court records, and stitched into the seams of white cotton coats. There, in a space where slavery and science overlapped, a quiet partnership grew. One that did not ask permission, one that did not speak the names of its victims, but one that built the foundation for much of modern medicine. In the early 1800s, the American South became a laboratory, not in the way Europe imagined laboratories with polished brass instruments and university halls, but in barns, kitchens, and back gardens, the corners of plantations where no one asked questions. Here, enslaved people were both the workforce and the subjects. Their bodies were studied, prodded, measured, sometimes healed, but only if healing served a purpose. Enslaved black women, in particular, became central to this hidden field of research. Their reproductive systems, their endurance, their resistance to disease, all became topics of clinical fascination. Plantation doctors, often self-trained or minimally educated, practiced new techniques on them without their consent. Stitched wounds, reset bones, even performed early forms of cesarean sections, not out of mercy, but out of curiosity, commerce, because an enslaved woman's fertility had a price, her ability to bear children, to nurse, to recover from trauma. These weren't just personal concerns. They were financial assets. She was not simply a person. She was production, and so medicine followed money. Doctors were hired to inspect women before sale, certify their breeding health. At auctions, a physician's word could increase a woman's value. She would be forced to stand naked, sometimes pregnant, while men in coats poked her abdomen and checked her teeth. Behind these public scenes was an even darker truth. Some doctors weren't just evaluating, they were experimenting. A small but influential group of Southern physicians began publishing papers based on procedures done on enslaved bodies. They rarely named their subjects. They often referred to them as Negro girl, aged 14, or female slave, property of Mr. W. Day, performed amputations to test surgical tools. They induced blisters to study skin healing. They forced substances into the womb to observe contractions. They injected mercury to measure response. Kang, they recorded everything, not in horror, but in pride. These records formed the early backbone of Southern medical journals, and the broader scientific community applauded. Some of these physicians were invited to speak in Philadelphia, Boston, even London. They were seen as pioneers, not because their methods were innovative, but because their access was unlimited. They could do what Northern doctors could not. They had test subjects who could not say no. That access was rooted in law. Under slavery, an enslaved person had no legal autonomy over their body. If a white doctor wanted to operate, all he needed was the enslaver's permission, and enslavers were usually eager. A healed worker meant restored labor. A fertile woman meant more children to sell. A medical curiosity solved might even bring prestige. There was no need to ask the woman. She was not a person in the eyes of the law. She was a resource. The doctors often kept journals, private and professional. In these, the clinical tone is chilling. Incise the abdomen of the subject. One wrote to observe uterine bleeding. Another described restraining a woman to ensure cooperation. A third noted how a Negro girl expired after a trial of experimental catharsis. These were not villains in their own minds. They were men of science, and the pain they caused was not punishment. It was progress. At least, that's what they told themselves. Meanwhile, the women endured, sometimes quietly, sometimes with screams that could be heard beyond the barn walls, but always without consent. Their knowledge, their pain, their recoveries, their resistance never made it into the literature. What they said, how they felt, how they prayed, or coped, none of it was written down, because that wasn't what the journals were for. And yet, they knew things the doctors didn't. They knew which herbs slowed bleeding. They knew how to wrap cloth to stop infection. They knew how to comfort one another when the blade came out again. This quiet, hidden network of enslaved women passing down healing from hand to hand was medicine, too, but it wasn't science. At least, not in the eyes of the men holding the pens. Asterisks, they called it superstition. The way black women used boiled leaves and wrapped wounds in ash. The way they whispered prayers over laboring bodies or fed molasses to stop the shakes. To the white doctors of the South, these traditions were folklore at best, witchcraft at worst. But what they never acknowledged was that some of the miracles they recorded in their journals came not from their scalpels, but from the women themselves. Because healing wasn't just a procedure. It was survival, and survival in a world where one's body could be borrowed without warning was a form of quiet rebellion. Throughout the mid-1800s, the South continued to churn out articles for American medical journals. Some of these journals, like the Southern Medical and Surgical Journal, became platforms for physicians who had spent years testing on the bodies of enslaved women. They described complicated cases, uterine prolapse, third-degree perineal tears, fibroid removal, postnatal trauma. All of it recorded without anesthesia, without consent. Okay, and without the names of the women. Asterisk. One such physician, Dr. Francois Labat of Louisiana, became known for performing surgeries on enslaved women in his home clinic. He kept detailed notes describing how the patient bore the pain well, how suturing was completed in under an hour, how the subject was returned to her quarters for recovery. She had no voice in the write-up. Only her reaction mattered, and only to validate the doctor's performance. The broader scientific community never questioned how these procedures were permitted, because permission was never part of the process. In the antebellum South, science and slavery were not just neighbors, they were partners. A man with a plantation could rent out a woman for a study. A doctor could offer medical services in exchange for access. Hospitals, where they existed, had separate wings for black patients. In many towns, enslaved people were treated outdoors, under sheds, in converted barns. There was no privacy, no second opinions. And if the patient died, there was no inquest, just a line in a book and the arrival of the next subject. Even in cities where medical schools were growing, cadavers were in constant demand. Many of those cadavers came from grave robbing, specifically from black cemeteries. This practice, quietly known among medical students as resurrectionism, was so common that families began guarding graves at night, sitting with lanterns, placing heavy stones atop the mounds. The hospitals claimed ignorance. The professors claimed necessity. The students claimed it was just part of their education. And the bodies continued to spear. But experimentation wasn't limited to the dead. Some procedures were done with the thinnest justification. In 1854, a physician in Georgia performed a partial clitoridectomy on an enslaved woman who had no reproductive complaints. He believed it would calm her temperament. He later wrote that she became more compliant afterward, though he offered no evidence, and she never spoke for herself. Another doctor used a hot iron to cauterize the cervix of a woman with mild bleeding. She fainted mid-procedure. When she awoke, she screamed for her child. The doctor noted her reaction as hysterical and prescribed bed rest, not for the pain, but for emotional instability. What these men saw as medicine, these women experienced as invasion. And yet, they continued to survive. Sometimes because of each other. Because even in clinics and hospitals, slave women found ways to share knowledge. They warned one another in whispers, hid herbs in pockets, shared the names of the few doctors who treated them with basic decency, passed on stories of those who'd gone before, not just as warnings, but as a kind of map. They were not passive. They were not just victims. They were strategists in their own quiet resistance. And occasionally, one woman would refuse. There are rare records, it's always buried in court documents or private correspondence, of women who fought back, who ran from surgical sites, who scratched the faces of doctors, who begged their enslavers not to hand them over. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but even the refusal was noted, and even that note became part of the lesson, a warning to future doctors that the subjects might resist. By the 1850s, some physicians in the North began to raise questions about Southern practices. Quiet ones. Letters exchanged between doctors hinted at concerns of ethics, but nothing formal was done. No regulation passed, no guidelines created, because medicine, at the time, still believed that progress justified the pain. So, as long as the pain wasn't theirs, and when the Civil War broke out, experiments did not stop. In fact, they increased. Hospitals became military outposts. Enslaved people who fled to Union camps often found themselves treated or tested by surgeons unfamiliar with black physiology and uninterested in consent. The pain simply changed hands in the belief that black people felt less pain, that their bodies were better for experimentation, that their healing could be manipulated without permission, followed medicine into its next era. So we return to the operating rooms, to the barns, to the spaces behind locked doors where no one asked her name, where she lay on a table she never walked toward willingly, where men in coats called her subject, and where her silence was interpreted not as fear, but as permission. Asterisk, the Civil War ended. Slavery was abolished on paper, but in many ways, the practices of medical exploitation simply changed their clothes and kept walking. Doctors who had learned to cut on enslaved women now cut on freed women, many of whom had nowhere else to go. Hospitals remained segregated. Consent remained optional. And the idea that black women's bodies could be studied without full explanation stayed. The tools passed from one hand to the next. Forceps, speculums, surgical hooks, and thread. Students who had watched surgeries on enslaved women went on to perform their own. Professors who had built reputations on the suffering of the voiceless wrote textbooks that left those stories out. Those books were reprinted, updated, sanitized. Soon, no one questioned where the knowledge came from, because the pain had been scrubbed from the record, but not from the bodies. Many of the women who were experimented on lived well into the Reconstruction era. Some had children after the war. Some died young from complications that never healed. Some, though we'll never know their names, lived long enough to whisper their stories to grandchildren, to warn the next generation not to trust the white coats, to say softly, "Don't go to the hospital unless you have to." That mistrust was not paranoia. It was inherited wisdom, because even after slavery ended, the systems that allowed for medical abuse did not dissolve. Black women were still sterilized without consent into the 20th century, still excluded from clinical trials, still diagnosed with hysteria when they cried in pain, still told to be grateful for whatever care they received, even when it hurt them. The pain of progress, once so loudly defended, became quiet. It moved into policy, into practice, into the shrug of a doctor who dismisses a black woman's complaint as anxiety, into a hospital form that still doesn't explain everything, into a lingering fear in black communities that says, "You'll be studied before you're believed." And still, the women endure. They become doulas, nurses, professors, OBGYNs. They write the missing chapters. T's. They add footnotes to the textbooks that left them out. T. Demand that consent be more than a signature, that it be a conversation, choice, a dignity returned. In recent years, historians have begun to map the exact ways that slavery and medicine worked together. Archives have revealed letters between physicians and slave owners, receipts of payment for medical experiments, contracts outlining the terms of a body's use. Some of those contracts still exist in university collections. Some have never been read. In one, dated 1853, plantation doctor writes, "The girl shall be made available for uterine observation and returned in suitable condition for continued labor." Suitable condition, as if she were a machine. The language is cold, but it's also familiar, because parts of that language survive today. We still talk about outcomes, about patient compliance, about efficiency. What we talk about less is the past that shaped those terms. What we rarely say out loud is that entire specialties, gynecology, obstetrics, surgical medicine, were advanced on the backs of people who never got to speak. So we speak for them now. We name what they endured. And we remember that progress is not always clean, not always kind, and not always earned. Sometimes it is taken, but memory, even when painful, can be a form of repair. When we teach the full truth, when we walk into hospitals and carry their names with us, when we question the systems that still echo their silence, we begin, slowly, to change what healing means. And maybe one day, science will stop asking how much pain a person can endure and start asking why it ever needed to find out. Asterisk. The auction block was not just where lives were sold, it was where value was assigned. In the early 19th century, American South, enslaved women stood in lines not unlike livestock, stripped of both clothing and dignity, while men with ledgers moved among them. They pressed into hips. They checked teeth. They looked into eyes, not to find personality, but to estimate endurance. And for black women, the assessment often went deeper, because their value wasn't just physical strength. It was reproductive potential. Could she bear children? How many had she already had? Did she seem sound of womb? These weren't whispers. They were public evaluations, okay? And they weren't always based on guesswork, because by the 1820s, it had become common for physicians to accompany slave traders to auctions. These doctors came not as protectors, but as appraisers. Asterisk. They brought stethoscopes, scales, metal instruments. They asked questions the women could not refuse to answer, and sometimes they didn't just examine, they intruded. Pelvic exams were conducted on-site in holding yards. A woman who had just been marched hundreds of miles might be forced to lie on a cold wooden bench and spread her legs while a doctor searched for abnormalities. The goal was not her health. It was her price tag. One Southern medical manual, printed in 1846, advised planters to seek professional confirmation of female soundness before purchasing. Another suggested that habitual menstruation and absence of uterine complaint made a female slave a better long-term investment. Imagine that. Asterisk. The natural functions of a woman's body used as financial logic. Her fertility, the very possibility of children, came a line on an accounting sheet. But the auction block didn't end at the point of sale, because for many women, especially those bought to breed or to work in plantation households, the next stop after purchase was the doctor's table, to be cataloged, to be corrected, to be used. If a woman had difficulty conceiving, she might be taken to a physician, not for her comfort, but for repair, as one might fix a plow or reshoe a horse. Doctors experimented with tonics, with manual manipulations, with surgical interventions. One Alabama doctor recorded the use of heated compresses and internal scalding to revive uterine vigor. He did not record the screams, or the outcome. In some cities, like Charleston and New Orleans, specialist clinics emerged, places where enslavers could send their problem women. Sometimes these clinics were attached to medical schools. Students were invited to observe. Procedures were performed in front of audiences. The woman was either unconscious or awake. Didn't matter. She wasn't a patient. She was property, and property could not give consent. One particularly harrowing account comes from a plantation in Georgia, where a doctor wrote in his notes about a girl no older than 15, whose uterus he inspected. After reports of breeding failure, he used metal dilators to examine the passage. The exam caused bleeding. The girl fainted. He wrote that she will be revisited after rest, as though she were a locked cabinet to try again later. There's no follow-up, She disappears from the page, just like so many others. And still, life went on. These women, after being sold, examined, altered, were expected to return to work, to tend the fire, to care for their enslavers' children, to become pregnant, to deliver, to survive labor with no midwife, no rest, no medical help unless it served someone else's interests. Many didn't survive. Infant mortality among enslaved populations was staggeringly high. Maternal deaths were often recorded only as property losses. If a woman died giving birth, the enslaver mourned not her, but the lost asset. And still, women endured. They found one another in corners of the field, at night by the hearth, while washing clothes in the stream. They whispered stories about what to expect, what herbs to chew for cramps, how to turn during labor to ease the pressure, how to stitch torn flesh with steady fingers and no thread. This was medicine too, just wasn't written down, because no one with a pen cared to ask. The auction block and the operating room became extensions of the same violence. One was public, loud, brutal. The other was quieter, clinical, but just as violating, and both were built on the same idea that a black woman's body could be entered without invitation, that her insides were public territory, that her pain was irrelevant. Even the few women who managed to escape through flight, manumission, or survival into freedom carried the trauma. Some never bore children again. Some never trusted another doctor. It's cute, the memories locked deep where they pulsed and ached with every passing year. We read now from the journals and ledgers and manuals. We see their shadows, but not their faces. We learn what was done to them, but not what they thought or feared. coal, or tried to forget. What did she think, standing naked on the auction platform? What did she feel when the doctor's gloved hands reached inside her and no one called it violence? What did she whisper to herself afterward, just to stay whole? It's asterisk. After the auction, she was told to bathe. Okay, not because anyone cared for her comfort, but because her body now belonged to someone else. Cleanliness was expected of property. It's filmy. She may have been given new clothes, plain, stiff, smelling of starch. She may have been renamed. Some enslavers believed a woman worked better with a more refined name. Her old name, the one her mother whispered to her as a child, was erased as casually as a chalkboard. Then came the doctor in plantation records across the South. You'll find him listed. Dr. Ellis, to examine new girl, fee paid to Dr. J. Coulter for inspection of uterine health. Doctor summoned to assess breeding potential. These entries are wedged between other notations. Barrels of corn, mule shoes repaired. Purchase of one Negro girl, approx. 17 years. The doctor's visit was not an exception. It was part of the process. Her body had been bought with the expectation that it would multiply, and if it didn't, someone would be blamed. Not the enslaver, not the buyer, but her. Some enslaved women were sent directly to what were called breeding farms. These were places not of healing, but of forced reproduction, isolated and staffed with midwives and doctors, or, more often, men who styled themselves as such. They evaluated black women in batches. Pelvic exams were routine. Invasive procedures were standard. If a woman didn't become pregnant quickly, she might be forced to lie with another man, also enslaved. Also without choice until she did. The term breeder appears more than once in Southern inventories. The word was used without shame. The science of the day supported it. Medical manuals described Negro females as biologically suited for labor, for heat, for childbirth. Some claimed their pelvic bones were wider, that their pain tolerance was higher, that their sexual behavior was more aggressive. All lies, one of racism, and used to justify control. This pseudoscience entered textbooks. Young doctors were taught that black women were less sensitive, more durable, less human. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was curriculum, and with this belief came permission to probe, to open, to cut. One physician in Virginia in 1859 described surgically removing polyps from the uterus of an enslaved woman. She was given no anesthesia. He recorded that she did not complain excessively. No one asked why she didn't scream. Maybe she learned that screaming brought no relief. Maybe she had simply learned to leave her body when pain came. Another doctor experimented with contraceptive compounds, not to protect women's choices, but to control plantation births. He inserted mixtures into women's wombs. Some became violently ill. A few developed lifelong infections. He recorded his results and concluded the formula was worth future testing. No one followed up. No one asked the women if they wanted to avoid pregnancy, because choice wasn't the point. She was expected to deliver children. That was the only expected outcome. If the baby survived, it could be sold or retained for labor. If the baby died, she would be examined again, a fault, and the punishment would often fall on her. If her body failed, she might be sold again, downgraded, marked as infertile. Some women were sent to lesser work in the fields, in the kitchens, carrying heavy loads, even as their wombs ached from past traumas. Sometimes she was sterilized without warning, sutured in places no one explained, given medicines that burned her insides. Doctors did not always share what they'd done. Sometimes even the enslaver didn't know, but the outcome was clear. She would not give birth again. Whether it was done for punishment, for study, course, for health, the result was the same. No children, no future. And still, the women resisted in small, invisible ways. Some tied herbs into cloth and hid them in bodices. Natural contraceptives. Knowledge passed from grandmother to girl. Others delayed pregnancy through control of timing, refusing partners when they could, sneaking away in the night. Some women faked illness. Others gave birth in silence and mourned quietly when their children were taken. They endured in the only ways they could, by sharing, remembering, surviving. The medical community continued its work. Case reports appeared in journals, lectures were given in cities. Doctors became professors. None of them cited the women whose bodies taught them what they knew. No one noted the cost, but those costs were carried in scar tissue, in silent grief, in the look exchanged between two women bent over laundry, who knew, without needing to speak, what it meant to be examined like a tool. There were women who lived into old age, their backs bent, not just from labor, but from the weight of all that had been done to them, and yet they lived, tending to others, telling the younger women how to hide pain, how to carry memory, how to preserve even the smallest part of themselves, because that was the truest form of resistance they had, to remember, to endure, and to hold the quiet of their own bodies. The truth that their life was never a lesson for someone else's science. Asterisk, they said she was useful. That word showed up often in ledgers and letters. A useful girl, a useful breeder, a useful subject for treatment. But useful to whom, and at what cost? After the violence of the auction block and the intrusions of the exam table, an enslaved woman was expected to continue, not because she healed, but because she had no choice. Her trauma, physical, reproductive, emotional, was not a reason to stop work. It was a silent burden she was meant to carry. While cleaning someone else's floors or nursing someone else's children, she might return to the fields, her muscles still trembling from surgery. She might return to a cabin, her womb stitched or scarred, surrounded by whispers of other women asking if she bled. She might lie awake in the dark, wondering what had been taken from her. Asterisk. Sometimes she never knew. Medical procedures done on enslaved women were often undocumented beyond brief notes. A few lines about incisions or a reference to a corrected malformation. There are almost no follow-up notes, a long-term tracking, because their lives, in the eyes of those who studied them, did not need to be preserved, only the results. And the results were often claimed by others. A physician would take credit for discovering a new technique for managing childbirth complications without saying it was tested on an enslaved girl of 14. Another would describe improvements in postnatal stitching without mentioning the countless women who screamed while he learned. Their knowledge was written down. Their pain was not. The women themselves became ghosts in the medical literature, shadows behind innovations. Dames rarely appear in the indexes of textbooks, but their bodies live between the lines in the places where footnotes go missing. And so, they were made property twice. First, by the laws of slavery, then by the logic of medicine. Even after emancipation, this logic continued. Freed women found hospitals just as perilous. Segregated wards, underfunded clinics, doctors who remembered their mothers only as subjects. The instruments were cleaner, the words more polite, with the assumption that black women's bodies could be used, studied, doubted, remained. Many black women chose not to go to doctors at all. They relied instead on midwives, on older women in their communities, on the wisdom of plant roots, warm rags, whispered prayers, because they remembered, even if the textbooks didn't, what had been done in the name of care and even in freedom. They were reminded of what progress had cost them in 1927. One Southern doctor recalled during a lecture that his first lessons in gynecology had come from observing procedures on colored girls during my student years. He did not name them. He did not recall their fates. He moved on to talk about modern suturing. He had forgotten, but the women had not, and neither had their daughters. Generations of silence, passed down like heirlooms, with a quiet flinch during a medical exam, a reflexive mistrust of white coats, the refusal to answer certain questions. These were not superstitions, okay? They were inherited truths. And now, slowly, some of those truths are being written down. Historians are piecing together the records, auction logs, nautical, school documents. Artists are creating works that remember the unnamed. Scholars are asking uncomfortable questions about the foundations of their fields. In some medical schools, future doctors now read the names Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy. They are taught that these women were not just patients, but teachers without consent, without compensation, without recognition, but still teachers. And perhaps the most powerful lesson they offer is this: that survival is not consent, that usefulness is not humanity, that medicine is not neutral and never was. Today, when a black woman enters a hospital and asks her doctor for a second opinion, when she requests a full explanation before agreeing to a procedure, when she says no and insists that it be heard, she is not being difficult. She is remembering. She is refusing to be made useful for someone else's gain. She is carrying the memory of women who were used, who were cut, who were sold, and never got their names back. Asterisk in the hush of early morning, when the city above was just beginning to stir, with market carts rolling over cobblestones and gas lamps, flickering out. The basement of a southern medical school was already full of motion, not voices, not laughter, just the shuffle of aprons being tied, scalpels being laid out, and cadavers being uncovered. The students called them subjects. The professors called them specimens. No one called them people. No one asked their names. And yet, these bodies, cold, stiff, unmourned, taught everything from the mid-1800s through the early 20th century. Medical schools in the United States were desperate for material. Detection had become central to training. Future doctors were told they could not understand life unless they began with death. So cadavers were needed, many of them, always more, but few volunteered, especially not in the South, where poverty was high and trust in medicine was low. And so the schools turned to the only source that did not resist: black bodies. Some came from public hospitals, some from jails, especially from graveyards. Resurrection men hired body snatchers, became part of the medical system. They worked quietly, at night, often with the silent approval of city officials. They knew which cemeteries were unguarded, which plots held the recently buried, and which families could not afford to protect their dead. They did not target white cemeteries. They targeted black ones in New Orleans, Baltimore, Charleston, Richmond. The story repeated itself. Students or staff would arrive at dawn with fresh cadavers. The lecture would proceed. The bodies were sliced, examined, named only by a number or vague label: Negro male, caged, approximately 35. Colored woman, unknown. They were dissected for the sake of science and discarded when the lesson was over. Some schools burned the remains. Others buried them in mass, unmarked graves behind campus walls. Few schools kept records of what was done, not because it was secret, but because no one considered it important. And this was not limited to the dead. In teaching hospitals connected to medical schools, live patients, overwhelmingly black, poor, and voiceless, were used for clinical practice. Students learned how to stitch wounds, set bones, draw blood, and perform surgeries. Instructors called these learning moments. They reminded their students that real medicine requires real skin. Tote, whose skin? That question was never asked. In hospital wards designated for colored patients, procedures were often performed without anesthesia or without explanation. Consent was rarely sought. Medical students were told to observe, to participate, and to stay silent about the origin of their education. One woman, known only as K72 in the records of a Southern training hospital, was admitted for for abdominal pain. Over the course of 2 weeks, 3 different students performed pelvic exams. The supervising physician described the case as useful for instructional repetition. Nowhere in the file does it say what she thought or if she was asked. This was how generations of physicians learned, and the silence was passed on like a textbook in the basement. There was no ceremony, no prayer, no moment of recognition for the lives that had ended, and were now being used to begin someone else's career. There were only lessons. Observe the structure of the liver. Note the angle of the pelvis. Cut here, not there. Student hesitated. They were mocked. Don't be sentimental, one professor barked in a 1911 account from Georgia. That's not a person. That's a resource. Some students believed this. Others did not. But few spoke up because the system rewarded detachment. The more efficiently you worked, the more seriously you were taken. Students who lingered, who paused, who wondered aloud about the woman's name were seen as soft, unsuitable for medicine. It's emotional doubt, and so the culture hardened by the 1920s. The link between Black Death and white education was fully institutionalized. At some schools, it was formalized into donation systems, in theory. In practice, it was theft with paperwork. Medical museums displayed skulls. Medical libraries held jars of preserved organs. Visitors toured exhibits featuring interesting specimens, never told that these parts had once belonged to people who were never given a choice. In one southern university, the anatomy professor kept a rib cage mounted above his desk. It was labeled simply, Female Negroid, circa 1900. The students called it Lucy. They joked that she was always watching their tests. They did not know her name. They did not know her story. They did not ask asterisk upstairs, stairs. In the bright amphitheaters, where men with beards and waistcoats gave lectures, 2 rows of attentive students. Words like progress, innovation, and advancement echoed off the polished walls. Diagrams of nerves and arteries were chalked onto blackboards. Models were passed from hand to hand, but no one drew the path of a life. No, one diagrammed what happened before a body reached the table. There was no slide labeled how she lived. No chalk sketch labeled what he feared, 'cause the story that led to the body, the one beneath the scalpel, on the slab, had no place in the syllabus. And yet, that story existed. It began in burial grounds, behind old churches, where mourners wept quietly and hurriedly. Graves were often dug shallow, not because the mourners wanted it so, but because the earth was hard and the time was short. The next night, a man with a lantern would arrive. He would bring a spade, sometimes a cart. Sometimes he worked alone. Sometimes with others. He knew which graves to choose. Asterisk, new ones, black ones, unprotected ones. He would dig quickly, remove the body, wrap it in burlap, take it to the medical school basement. There was no ceremony, no shame. He was just doing his job, and the students. They arrived the next day, fresh from breakfast. They donned aprons. They sharpened blades. The body on the table might still have dirt beneath its fingernails. Sometimes it was clear, a woman's braids, a man's work-worn hands, a child, no more than 12. But the instructor would clear his throat and begin the lesson. Asterisk. This is the deltoid. This is the trachea. Doubt. This is how you make a clean incision. Never. This is the body of a man who was loved. Never. This was someone's mother. The idea that medicine could only advance through detachment had become dogma. Human empathy was considered a distraction. To become a doctor meant learning how not to flinch, and so the learning continued. In Baltimore, black mother begged a hospital not to take her deceased son's body. She had heard rumors from neighbors, from elders, about what happened to the dad. She was assured that all was proper. The next morning, she returned. The grave was disturbed. Her son was gone. In Atlanta, an 18-year-old girl was buried after a fever. The grave was robbed. Her body used in a classroom at a local medical school. No one notified the family. They learned about it only when a student recognized her from church and told someone in secret. These were not isolated stories, okay? They were part of a pattern. Medical education needed bodies, and black bodies, it was assumed, could be taken. Hospitals with attached schools, especially in the South, often kept paupers' wards. These were beds for the indigent, the homeless, the unnamed. But indigent often became a catch-all term for black patients. If one died and no one claimed the body within 24 hours, it could be turned over to the school, claimed by the state, handed over for science. But what if the family couldn't reach the hospital in time? What if they were barred from the building? What if they weren't told? The law said nothing about fairness, only about paperwork. And so, even in death, black people were denied rest in some schools. Its professors kept private collections. Skulls, jaws.pelvise is labeled by race and gender. Negro, female, estimated age 19. Mulatto, male, trauma to cranium. They were stored in cabinets, pulled out during guest lectures, admired for their condition. Never buried, never blessed. There were no ceremonies at the end of the semester. No moment of silence. The bodies were dissected, discussed, discarded. Students washed their hands, wrote their exams, moved on. And yet, not all forgot. Some students, decades later, wrote in memoirs of unease, of the Negro woman they dissected during anatomy class, of how her hands looked too much like their grandmother's, of how they wondered, briefly, if she had been taken from her grave. But they didn't ask, because the asking was dangerous. It threatened to pull the veil off the profession they were just entering. Better to believe that she had chosen this. Better to pretend her body was given, not taken. And so, the silence remained in the basements, in the catalogs, in the hands that cut while the minds refused to question, because no one ever gave the lecture that mattered most, the one that asked, at what point does healing begin to look like harm? Asterisks, by the mid-20th century, many of the basements had changed. The rooms were brighter now, the instruments stainless, the diagrams projected onto screens. Medical students wore white coats and carried clipboards. They filled out forms, followed protocols, and signed codes of conduct. There were policies now about consent, about ethics, about dignity. But still, no one looked back. The foundations of those institutions remained quiet. Beneath the polished hallways and commemorative plaques, beneath the libraries and research centers, were the ghosts of unmarked bodies, forgotten donors, unwilling teachers. The students no longer fetched cadavers from graveyards, but no one told them where the old ones had come from, and the silence had been passed on, generation to generation, as carefully as the scalpels. Some of those old medical schools still operate today, now as state-of-the-art hospitals and elite programs. Their websites list breakthroughs, Nobel laureates, endowed chairs named after founding professors, but rarely do they mention how those founders learned to cut, or on whom they do not say that Dr. So-and-so perfected his technique on enslaved women. They do not admit that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of cadavers came from robbed graves. They do not display the names of the black families whose loved ones disappeared under cover of darkness. They simply press forward. Progress. Always. But progress without memory is a dangerous thing, because when you do not remember the past, you build on it blindly, and the past, in these cases, was brutal. In 1994, workers renovating a parking lot in Philadelphia unearthed dozens of human remains. Forensics revealed they were from a 19th century medical school's anatomy lab, buried quickly, without coffins, mostly black. Many had cut marks on their bones. A few skulls were incomplete. There were no records in the school's archive. In 2003, a university in Georgia admitted that its old medical collections included body parts from at least 50 unidentified black individuals. Some of them had been preserved in jars for almost a century. In 2017, a student researching the history of anatomy labs discovered letters in a campus archive. Letters between faculty and local officials arranging for the procurement of bodies, almost all described as Negro or colored. The institutions responded quietly, a task force, a statement, an exhibit, but no names, and the women and men who lay in those basements, whose bodies were passed from table to table, still have no grave markers, still no ceremony, still no sleep, and yet their presence is undeniable. They taught anatomy. They taught resilience. They taught, without ever choosing to, what it means to be studied, but not seen. And in that uncomfortable truth lies a question for every future doctor. Every hospital, every institution that claims to heal. What do we owe to the people whose pain made our learning possible? Not just acknowledgement, not just a paragraph in a course book, but something quieter, deeper. A shift in how we see, a refusal to let the white coats and bright lights erase the stories that lived in the dark. Today, some schools are beginning to change. They host remembrance ceremonies for unclaimed bodies. They create ethical standards rooted in transparency and respect. They ask students to reflect, not just on procedures, but on people. Some programs now begin anatomy lab with a moment of silence. A few ask students to write thank you notes, even if the donor was unnamed. It's a start, but it cannot undo what was done. It cannot give those women their voices back, or their names, or the right to sleep peacefully without fear of being lifted from the earth once more. Still, memory matters, and when we remember them, not as tools or data or chapters, but as people, then maybe, just maybe, we begin to rebuild medicine with something stronger than steel. We build it with truth. Asterisk, she had seen more births than any white doctor in the county. Her name was Miss Eliza, though no one ever called her Miss in public. To most, she was just Eliza. Sometimes the midwife. Sometimes the colored woman with the healing hands. But behind closed doors, the back cabins and hot kitchens where enslaved women whispered their truths, Eliza was something more. She was the one who came when it was time. When the labor pains began, when the blood started to flow, when the silence between contractions stretched too long, Eliza would arrive with her bag of cloth and dried herbs. She rarely spoke above a whisper. She moved slowly, but her hands were quick. She'd tie up her sleeves, fill the shape of the belly, light a small fire in the corner of the room. She'd seen women give birth in mud, on pine planks, in the dark, while others picked cotton just yards away. She did not flinch. Not anymore, but even Eliza had her limits. She had seen what happened when the white doctors came, not for healing, but for studying. She had stood in the back of the room, arms folded, lips pressed together, while a young, enslaved girl was laid across a table. The girl was barely 15. Her eyes searched for someone to protect her. Eliza had tried. Tia, she had offered to manage the labor herself. She'd told the overseer she'd done it before, dozens of times. But the doctor had insisted, needed to observe the tearing. He said it like it was weather, like it wasn't about to happen to a real person. Eliza stood there while he inserted metal instruments into the girl's womb. She watched the girl grab at the table, his toes curling against the wood. She remembered how her own daughter had once cried the same way. That night, Eliza walked home in silence. Her bag still smelled of lavender and blood. She placed it down on her porch, sat beside it, didn't move until dawn, because something had broken, not just in the girl, but in the world. Eliza had always understood pain. She'd seen women lose babies. She'd seen them scream, bleed, die, But this was different. This wasn't nature. This wasn't labor. This wasn't birth. This was a performance for students, an education made from suffering. And she, the woman who had once been trusted by every plantation from Baton Rouge to Bayou Teche, had been reduced to a bystander. The white doctor never asked her what she saw, never asked how she would have handled it, never asked what the girl needed. Once the bleeding began, Eliza had trained herself for decades, not in classrooms, but with hands in the soil, ears tuned to breath. She knew how to measure contractions with her eyes, how to turn a breech baby with a gentle twist, how to slow a hemorrhage with hot water and pressure and prayer. But none of that was science. Not to them, asterisk. To them, Eliza was useful until they wanted credit. And then she disappeared. Over the years, Eliza stopped offering her services to the main house. She stayed in the quarters. She worked quietly, tending to the women who feared the hospital more than they feared death. She treated fevers. She stitched torn skin. She taught girls how to squat when labor came, how to breathe, how to hide their fear until it was safe. Sometimes she had to deliver stillborns. Sometimes she had to lie to tell a mother that her baby had gone peacefully. And sometimes she had to watch as the doctor came anyway, claiming the child as a curiosity, wanting to inspect its head or measure its weight or compare it to others. But Eliza never stopped watching. She remembered the names. She remembered who bled too much and who whispered afterward that they had felt themselves leave their body. She remembered the girl who never stopped shaking after the white doctor used a speculum on her and said, "This one is whiter than most." She remembered the babies taken from their mother's arms. The girls called barren because a man's violence left them numb. She remembered how many times she had asked to help and been told she was not trained, but she was trained, just not in the language they understood. Her notes were not written in ink, but in memory. Her lab was the firelit corner of a cabin. Her mentors were the women who had survived, and her textbooks were the bodies she had held until their trembling stopped. But even memory has limits, and one night, after tending to a mother who had just survived a brutal breech birth, without any doctor, without light, with only Eliza and her calloused hands, she walked out into the fields and cried. Not loud, just enough, because she knew that if the mother lived, the doctor would take credit, and if the mother died, the blame would fall on Eliza. Either way, the story wouldn't be hers. It would be written by someone who hadn't even been there. So she began to whisper the truth into the ears of girls too. Young to bleed, she told them, "You listen to me now. They don't care if you scream. So scream loud if you must. Bite your tongue if you must. But never believe they know you better than you know yourself." And the girls listened, even when they didn't understand yet, because they heard something in Eliza's voice that the doctors never had. They heard survival, and that was something they could trust. Asterisk, Eliza did not carry notebooks. She carried stories, tucked beneath her tongue, dated, folded into her palms, layered in glances, exchanged across firelight. She knew how to bring life into the world because she had watched it done without painkillers, without preparation, and sometimes without hope. Her teachers were not professors, okay? They were women whose names never appeared in any textbook. And now, Eliza was one of them, the living archive. She knew when the baby would come too early by the tilt of the mother's hips. She knew which root would still the cramping, which leaf could slow the bleeding. She knew when to send for help and when it was too late to try. But no one ever called her doctor. Instead, it took what she knew and called it theirs. The white doctor at the edge of town, the one who sometimes came only after the baby crowned, would watch her quietly. He would notice the angle of her hand, the way she rubbed the mother's back, the way she hummed under her breath during labor. Later, he would write about it in letters. in a paper for the Medical Society in Baton Rouge. He would mention a curious method used by a Negro midwife, but not name her. He would try the method himself, fail, then try again with someone watching, and one day it would be his technique. But Eliza already knew it worked. She had used it on her sister and her cousin, a pea, and 3 girls born from her own belly, none of whom had survived past childhood. She knew it worked because she had nothing else. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that her way of knowing would be stolen again and again, repackaged as innovation, disconnected from the calloused hands that first made it possible. She was never invited to the clinics, lecture halls, the birthing demonstrations, but they came to her, doctors, students, men in stiff coats, who asked questions. They pretended were polite. What do you do when the babies breach? How do you know when to cut the cord? Do you believe in letting her eat during labor? Sometimes, Eliza answered. Sometimes she stayed quiet, stared at their shoes, and let the silence do the talking. Because she knew they weren't asking to learn. They were asking to take. And the ones who took never came back. They used her wisdom in rooms where women like her were not allowed to stand. But she kept working. She sat beside beds made of straw, wiped sweat from brows, caught babies as they slipped into the world, still blue and slippery with blood. She whispered blessings. She laid hands on wombs. She listened when no one else did, and when the doctors failed, when the surgery was too rough, when the mother didn't make it, when the screams turned into silence. It was Eliza who was blamed. She should have called sooner. She didn't keep the wound clean. She interfered with the procedure. No one asked what she had seen. No one recorded that the procedure was done without consent. No one wrote that the doctor had been learning on the job, using tools meant for cows, not humans. No one wrote that the mother had begged Eliza, not the doctor, to stay, because the doctor had the pen, and Eliza had only memory. Still, she didn't leave, because memory, when repeated often enough, becomes resistance, and Eliza was a resistance all her own. She began to train others, not in lecture halls, but in back rooms and under moonlight. Young girls from the quarters would sneak away at dusk. Eliza would teach them what no one else would: how to clean a blade with boiled bark, how to check a mother's breath after birth, how to stop a hemorrhage with firm hands and steady pressure. She called them my girls. The doctors called them unlicensed. The state called them illegal. But the women in labor called them when they needed saving, because even though hospitals were beginning to modernize, even though sterilized tables and white uniforms now replaced the barn floors and dirty rags, the fear remained. Women were still ignored, still cut without explanation, still stitched without consent. And so Eliza's work remained necessary. In fact, it's more than ever, because the more medicine modernized, the less it listened. Eliza's teachings became a hidden curriculum, passed down not through textbooks, but through touch, song, and memory. She told the girls to never trust a man who doesn't ask your name before putting his hands on you. She told them to always bring extra cloth and always boil twice. She told them to listen, not just to the body, but to what the mother won't say, because that was where the truth lived. Eliza had seen it all: the knife, the numbness, the baby's first breath, the mother's last, and she carried it all in silence until she began to pass it on. One girl asked her once, "Ain't you tired, Miss Eliza?" Eliza looked down at her hands, brown and lined and cracked with time. "I've been tired," she said, "but I ain't done yet." Asterisk, Eliza lived to be almost 80. No one knows the exact year of her birth, only that she was already grown by the time the Union soldiers came through. That meant she had lived through slavery, war, Reconstruction, and the long, slow burn of Jim Crow. She had delivered hundreds of babies in dirt floor shacks, in field beds, in half-collapsed cabins during storms, and she remembered every one, not the names, always, but the moments. The sound a mother made right before the water broke. The quiet sobs when the father stood outside, afraid to come in. The look in a girl's eyes when she realized she'd survived. Something no one thought she would. These were her records. There was no license on the wall, no framed degree, just an old wooden chair in the corner of her cabin. A pot, always simmering, fond bundles of herbs tied in little knots above the stove. People kept coming, even when hospitals opened their doors to black patients. Even when government midwifery laws made her work technically illegal, they still came, because Eliza was known, trusted, not just for what she could do, okay, but for what she refused to do. She never touched without explaining. She never reached without asking. She never spoke for someone else's pain. She listened to it. Sometimes young nurses, fresh out of segregated nursing schools, came to watch her work. They came in white shoes and pressed uniforms, notebooks in hand, skeptical, but by the end of the delivery, their notes were forgotten. Because Eliza didn't teach in words. She taught in rhythm, timing, in breath. And when the baby came, as it always did, one way or another, she'd look at them and say, "Now you know." She didn't mean the anatomy. She meant the responsibility. Asterisk. Not every story ended gently. Some mothers bled too much. Some babies didn't breathe. Eliza stayed until the end, every time. She never left the room early, never let a woman pass into death alone. She would wash the body, close the eyes, sit by the fire in silence with the family. She said it was her way of telling the ancestors what had happened, so the woman wouldn't arrive on the other side alone. And in a world that rarely made space for mourning, that mattered. But the laws kept tightening by the 1940s. State governments across the South were cracking down on granny midwives. Officials argued they were unsanitary, untrained, outdated. Young white doctors wanted control of childbirth, and the hospitals wanted the money that came with it. Asterisk. Licenses became required. Permits, records, exams. Many of the women who'd caught generations of babies were suddenly deemed illegal. Eliza didn't fight it. She simply faded into the background, letting the younger ones take over. She trained them as best she could, whispered the old ways when no one else was listening, told them where to press, when to push, when to wait. But she also told them how to navigate the new world. Speak calm, she'd say. Even when you're right. Don't say it too fast. Let them have their clipboard. You have your hands. And when they ignore her, you don't. One of the last babies she ever caught grew up to be a nurse. That nurse, years later, stood in front of a panel of physicians in a teaching hospital and gave a lecture on black maternal care. She spoke calmly, clearly. She explained the statistics, the disparities, the dangers. And then, at the end, she said, "There was a woman who taught me everything I know. She had no papers, no title, no degree. But she taught me what they don't teach in here." She paused, and when she caught me, I didn't cry. But she did. No one in the room responded at first, because, for a moment, silence of the past was too loud to ignore. Eliza never had a statue, no plaque, no scholarship in her name. But she had memory, and that memory lived on in every baby whose mother felt seen, in every young nurse who chose to stay in the room, in every breath taken by someone who survived because a woman with rough hands and quiet eyes refused to walk away. Eliza watched the experiments. She remembered the names. No one wrote down. She bore witness, and in doing so, she left behind something stronger than law, or medicine, or science. She left behind truth. She wasn't sick when they brought her in. That's what makes her story different, or perhaps more common than we'd like to admit. She was about 17, maybe 18. No fever, no injury, no complaints, except for a vague discomfort she'd mentioned once to the woman who cleaned the kitchen. It might have been hunger, or fatigue, or nothing at all. But in the strange math of the time, that was enough. Enough for a visit to the doctor. Enough for a body to be handed over, quietly, for observation. Because in the early 1900s, and decades before and after, black women didn't need to be sick to be studied. They just needed to be available. And she was no family to ask questions, no papers to sign, no voice that would be heard, even if she'd raised it. She was admitted to a southern teaching hospital and taken to the back wing, the one where the floors were scrubbed clean, not for sanitation, but for show. The nurses were young, the doctors were younger, most were white, all were curious. They said she was ideal. Ideal for what? That part was never explained. The physician in charge had been reading European journals about uterine positioning, about theories that black women had thicker linings, higher cervixes, less sensitivity. None of it was proven. Most of it was racist fantasy, but fantasy dressed as science is a dangerous thing. So they began to measure, not treat, not heal, just measure. She lay on a narrow bed, legs strapped at the ankles, hands held gently but firmly by two nurses who had learned not to ask questions. Instruments were inserted, angles recorded, measurements taken. A speculum was opened wider than necessary to observe elasticity. No anesthesia, no explanation. They called it an exploratory exam. She called it nothing because she never had the chance to speak. There was no diagnosis, no symptom to relieve, just a question. What will we find? Not for the procedure to continue. The physician made notes in a ledger. Subject tolerated the procedure well. That phrase would appear often in hospital reports. Tolerated, as though not screaming was consent, as though silence meant agreement. But silence can mean many things. It can mean confusion, or fear, or the learned stillness of someone who knows that movement makes things worse. She stayed in the hospital for a week, not because she was healing, but because they wanted to watch her serve natural cycles, track uterine response, more exams, more notes. Sometimes medical students came to watch. She wasn't sick, but every day she was treated, and every day she left with less of herself than before. After discharge, there was no follow-up, no instructions, no medication, just a pat on the hand and a note added to the file. Specimen completed. Not patient, not woman, specimen. This was not a rare case. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, medical schools and hospitals across the United States, particularly in the South, used black women for clinical experimentation, not because they were ill, but because they were there. In some cases, they were taken from poorhouses or prisons. In others, they were donated by employers, a cruel extension of the slavery-era belief that black bodies could be used as property. And sometimes, like this girl, they simply fell through the cracks. Their records, and they existed, used language that hid the violence, non-therapeutic intervention, routine gynecological observation, physiological trial. But there was nothing routine about it in what was learned. Often, very little. The procedures were rarely about discovery. More often, they were about rehearsal, about practicing on a body that no one would miss. One teaching hospital in Mississippi recorded over 200 pelvic exams performed in a single semester, many on the same group of women, some of whom had no medical complaints. It was practice, repetition, a slow erosion of dignity, repackaged as education, and no one stopped it, because the women weren't seen as patients. They were seen as tools. Asterisk, she told someone, later, quietly, in the dark, when no one else was around, that it felt like she wasn't real anymore. Not after what they did, not after the gloves, the instruments, the questions she didn't understand, the laughter, sometimes, from young men in coats, the way they talked over her body like it wasn't even hers. I wasn't even sick, she whispered, and that was true. but in those long hallways that didn't matter. She wasn't brought in to be healed. She was brought in to be looked at, opened, measured, explained in medical records. Her name was abbreviated. First letter only, last name spelled wrong. She was recorded as NG number 18, a shorthand meaning Negro girl number 18, a code that appeared in one doctor's notes more than 24 times, suggesting she was returned for multiple exams. She was never told why. One week, they inserted a rubber balloon into her uterus to study pressure thresholds. The doctor noted mild discomfort and unusual resistance. There's no mention of how long the device remained in place. Another note mentions a test of speculum tolerance over time. The nurse log says she remained still throughout. Stillness was interpreted as strength, as cooperation, stata. But that wasn't what it was. It was resignation. And she wasn't alone throughout the late 1800s and into the early 20th century. Black women in institutional settings, hospitals, asylums, reform schools, were subjected to repeated procedures under the guise of advancing medical understanding. The exams were not requested. The women were not asked. In many cases, they were told the procedures were routine. They weren't. They were curiosity. Drapes weren't always used. Curtains stayed open. Observers came and went. Sometimes 10 or 12 medical students watched a single exam. The women were positioned, examined, measured. No one told them what was being studied. They were not warned when something would hurt. Pain was part of the lesson. Observe her response. Professor might say, "See how the cervix resists." But no one observed her face. The women weren't believed to feel pain the way others did, an idea that had survived from the days of slavery. That myth gave permission. It meant doctors didn't flinch when someone cried out. It meant they could note mild discomfort when what they heard was a scream. And it meant students learned early that pain wasn't important, not if it came from a certain kind of body. There was no recovery room, no debriefing after dark. The procedures. The women were sent back to shared wards, given bread and broth, sometimes nothing at all. Bleeding was expected. Silence was appreciated. A nurse might offer a glance, cloth, a word of comfort whispered under her breath. But the system rolled on. This wasn't medicine. This was training, and the body was just a tool. In some cases, the women were children, 14, 15 girls, who would come in for headaches, for rest, for stomach aches caused by hunger, only to be labeled of interest and pass through multiple hands. No one told their mothers. If their families asked too many questions, they were dismissed, or worse, told to be grateful for the care. Irony was thick, because this wasn't care. This was extraction of knowledge, of data, of compliance, and it didn't stop when the women left. Some were sterilized without their knowledge, told they'd had female surgery or been treated for infection. It wasn't until years later, when they tried to conceive, when the bleeding didn't stop, that they realized something had been taken. No explanation, no apology, just silence. Hospitals didn't keep those records. Doctors didn't revisit those charts. The names faded, but the damage remained in bodies, in memories, in the quiet fear passed down to daughters and granddaughters. Fear of hospitals, of white coats, of being touched without being seen, and in the present day. That fear still lingers. Studies continue to show that black women are less likely to be believed when they describe pain, that their symptoms are more often dismissed, that consent is more likely to be assumed than confirmed. The past was not past, it was instruction, and the worst lesson it taught was that healing didn't need permission, only opportunity. But there were always women who remembered. They didn't publish papers. They didn't speak at conferences. They spoke to each other in kitchens, on porches, in churches. Quiet stories passed down like recipes. How to say no, It's how to ask the right questions. It's how to watch a doctor's hands, not just his smile, because someone had to protect the ones coming next. Asterisk.